70%. One company, one product. 70% of every lawnmower sold in Australia. At their peak, Victa ran 3 shifts out of a factory complex the size of a city block in Western Sydney. They employed over 1,000 workers. They shipped 200,000 machines a year, every year, directly into the backyards of a nation that treated its lawn like a religion. For a time in the early 1960s, they were the single largest exporter of consumer hardware in the entire country. A backyard inventor from Concord had built a machine so perfectly matched to its moment that it didn't just dominate the market, it became the sound of the Australian weekend. Every Saturday morning, from Darwin to Hobart, you could step outside and hear it. That high, 2-stroke buzz, that unmistakable aggressive rattle, 3 backyards over and getting closer. And then it stopped. The factory went silent. The workers scattered. The car park that had filled every morning at 6:15 started showing gaps. 1 row, then 2, then the whole thing empty by the end. The machines that defined the Australian backyard for 30 years are still sold today. They're just made somewhere else now. And the men and women who knew how to build them here never got another morning shift. So how does something that dominant just end? That's what we're here to find out. Chapter 1. The Man with the Right Problem. Mervyn Victor Richardson was 48 years old in 1952, broke and running out of ideas. He had spent the post-war years in a small workshop in Concord, in Sydney's inner west, trying to invent his way out of financial obscurity. A concrete mixer that never worked right. A hedge trimmer nobody wanted. A series of other contraptions whose names history has not bothered to preserve, probably for good reason. He had the obsession of a genuine engineer, the kind of man who cannot look at a problem without immediately starting to dismantle it. But obsession without the right problem is just stubbornness. For most of the late 1940s, Richardson had plenty of stubbornness and very little money. Because post-war Australia was doing something extraordinary. The federal government's mass immigration program was pouring people into the new suburbs faster than the infrastructure could keep up. Fibro houses on freshly cleared land, quarter-acre blocks that a decade earlier had been paddock. And every single one of those blocks came with a lawn, couch grass and buffalo and kikuyu, tough as white cable, growing in the summer heat with a kind of aggressive indifference to human preference. These were not the gentle, manicured lawns of an English country estate. These were Australian lawns. Feral, relentless. Absolutely unmoved by the heavy cast-iron British reel mowers that the hardware shops were selling for the price of a week's wages. In his Concord workshop in 1952, he built a prototype. A rotating horizontal blade spinning fast enough to slash through anything in its path, mounted under a lightweight pressed steel body that anyone could push. The rotary concept had been patented in America a decade earlier, but nobody had built it specifically for Australian conditions, for Australian grass, for Australian backyards. Richardson had. His machine weighed 11 kilograms. You could pick it up with one hand. He was obsessive about the engine note. He adjusted the exhaust until the sound was right. Not quiet, not polite, pussyful. A sound, he told people, that should make the whole neighbourhood want to come outside. He called it Victa, a nod to his middle name, Victor, and the Latin word for conquest. Some accounts say he just liked the sound of it. Either way, it was right. One hardware retailer, shown the prototype, told Richardson it was a toy. Richardson demonstrated it in the man's own backyard. The retailer still wasn't interested. Richardson went home and started taking orders from his neighbours instead. Chapter 2. The Wave. The first Victas didn't come with a warranty. They came with Richardson's home phone number and a promise that if something went wrong, he would come and fix it himself. You cannot build a billion-dollar company on that model. And yet, Within 2 years, Richardson couldn't keep up with demand. Here's what happened. The word-of-mouth network of Australian suburbia in the early 1950s was faster and more powerful than any advertising campaign Richardson could have afforded anyway. The fence conversation, the footy club, the Saturday morning hardware shop where men gathered and talked about the practical problems of their practical lives. One man tried the Victa. His neighbour saw the result. His neighbour's brother-in-law heard about it. By 1954, Richardson was turning away orders. By 1955, he had moved to a proper factory in Concord and hired his first production team. By 1957, he was producing thousands of mowers a year and still couldn't fill the orders. He made one decision in those early years that locked in his market position for a decade and deserves more credit than it usually gets. Spare parts, available everywhere, priced cheaply. If your Victa broke down, and early models sometimes did, you could fix it yourself in your own shed, with a spanner and a part from any hardware shop in the country. Richardson understood something most manufacturers never figure out. He wasn't selling a machine. He was selling a relationship. The Victa was going to live in that household for years. The sale was just the beginning. And then came the exports. By the late 1950s, Richardson was shipping to Britain, to New Zealand, to South Africa. Let that sit for a second. A man in a workshop in suburban Sydney was selling lawnmowers to the country that had built the original lawnmower, the colony, sending its machines back to the empire. For a time in the early 1960s, Victa was the single largest exporter of consumer hardware from Australia. Not automobiles, not steel, lawnmowers, from Concord. The factory at Concord was already straining to breaking point. What they built next would define the company for 40 years. Chapter 3. The Empire. The Rydalmere complex. If you want to understand what Victa became, you need to stand inside that factory at its peak, a major industrial site in Sydney's west that eventually covered dozens of acres, running production lines that never stopped, turning out between 200,000 and 250,000 mowers every single year. The workforce at peak exceeded 700 people on the floor alone. Add sales, distribution, administration. The apprenticeship program formerly recognised by the New South Wales Department of Labour, and you're closer to 1,000. The car park outside the main entrance was full every morning by 6:15. The shift change was loud enough to hear from the street. Steel came from BHP at Newcastle and Port Kembla. Engines arrived in bulk shipments that required dedicated logistics. The paint booths applied Victa's green and red livery to hundreds of machines every working day. The tool room, the quality control floor, the dispatch bays where finished mowers moved out in their hundreds to hardware shops across the country, to the export containers bound for Britain and New Zealand, to the new suburban garages of a nation that was still building itself in real time. 200,000 mowers a year in a country of 12 million people. That is not a product. That is infrastructure. This is also where the Ferraro family enters the story. Aldo Ferraro arrived from Calabria in 1955 with almost no English, a single suitcase, and a contact from the Catholic Church in Parramatta who knew someone at the Rydalmere plant. He was on the engine fitting line within 3 months. He stayed for 10 years. He bought a house in St Mary's on Victa wages, put his kids through the local school, joined the union, and built his entire Australian life inside those factory walls. He didn't talk much about the factory to his son Gianni. He didn't need to. The factory was just the horizon. It was where you went. It was what the family was. That assumption, quiet, total, completely reasonable in 1965, would eventually cost the Ferraros everything. But first, it was going to make them. Chapter 4. The Peak. 60 to 70% of the Australian domestic mower market. Say that number out loud. In the history of Australian consumer goods, There is arguably no single brand that has ever achieved that kind of market concentration and held it for as long as Victa held it. Not in food, not in appliances, not in hardware. 60 to 70% for nearly a decade in a country where the backyard was not just a piece of land, but a statement about who you were and how seriously you took your obligations to the neighbourhood that could see it. The television commercials from this era, roughly 1966 to 1972, the absolute apex, are fascinating documents. A family in a perfectly kept suburban backyard, dad on the Victa, kids on the grass, the sky impossibly blue. The mower starts on the first pull every single time. These advertisements were not selling a machine. They were selling a social contract. The well-maintained lawn was the public face of the private life, and the Victa was the instrument through which a man demonstrated his standards to everyone who walked past. It worked because it was true. Australians took their lawns with a seriousness that, from the outside, probably looked slightly unhinged. In 1968, Gianni Ferraro, Aldo's son, now 20 years old, started in the press shop at Rydalmere, 400 steel body panels per shift. He had never seriously considered working anywhere else. An older Calabrian worker named Nino, who had been on the floor since 1963, took him under his arm that first week, showed him where the union delegates sat, showed him which foreman to avoid, showed him the lunch spot near the loading bay that caught the breeze in summer. Nino had welded parts into somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 machines by the time Gianni arrived. He had an opinion about everything and the seniority to express it. He said, "Better than any church," to Gianni once, gesturing at the floor around them. He added, "At least here, they pay you." Gianni laughed. He would remember that line for the rest of his life. This was the empire at full power. It would never be this good again. Chapter 5. What the advertisements never showed. Here's what a Victa mower actually cost to build. Not in dollars, in bodies. The industrial injury record at Australian manufacturing facilities in the 1960s was, by any modern measure, a scandal that was simply accepted as the price of production. Assembly line work involving metal pressing, grinding and high-speed components was among the most dangerous categories of employment in the country. The AMWU's New South Wales branch records document a sustained pattern of hand and finger injuries at press shop operations throughout this decade. Lost time injuries running at rates that would shut a facility down instantly today. The noise levels in the pressing section caused measurable hearing loss over the course of a career. This was known. It was documented. It was managed, which in this context meant tolerated. For the migrant workers who formed the backbone of the Rydalmere workforce, the Italians, the Greeks, the Maltese, the Yugoslavs, men whose English was limited and whose understanding of their legal rights was even more limited, the structural disadvantage was real and documented in parliamentary submissions from the period. You didn't complain. You kept your head down. You kept your job. Gianni Ferraro lost part of a finger to a press malfunction in 1971. He did not report it. He was afraid of losing the job. The supervisor handed him a cloth and told him to take 20 minutes. He was back on the line before lunch. He told his son Tommy about it once, years later. Not as a complaint, just as a fact. The way you describe a scar, you'd stop noticing. The AMWU was active at Rydalmere and fought hard on wages and conditions throughout the 1970s. Management pushed for faster throughput. The union pushed back. The relationship was functional and tense in the way that most large Australian manufacturing facilities of the era were functional and tense, managed friction, not partnership. The workers understood the mowers needed to get out the door. Management understood that a workforce in open revolt was a production line that stopped. The tension held, mostly, But underneath all of it, the wages, the injuries, the union negotiations, the afternoon shift change and the pub at 4:15, the entire system was sitting inside a glass house. And someone was about to throw a rock at it. Chapter 6. The Glass House. Here is what most people don't understand about Victa's dominance. It was never really about the mower. It was about the wall. Australian tariff protection in the 1960s and 1970s was, by international standards, extraordinary. Import duties on competing lawnmowers from Britain, from America, from the emerging Asian manufacturers ran at levels that made foreign products effectively unaffordable for the average suburban household. Victa didn't need to be the best mower in the world. It didn't need to be the most innovative or the most efficiently produced. It just needed to be cheaper than the taxed alternative. And it was, comfortably, every year, for 20 years. This protection had built something real, genuine engineering capability, a skilled workforce. Communities in Western Sydney that had calibrated their entire economic lives around a factory protected by a government that had decided Australian manufacturing was worth keeping. That was not nothing. But here is what the tariff wall also built, quietly in the background, in the rooms where the hard decisions didn't get made. Complacency. When you don't have to beat the world, you stop training like you have to beat the world. When the margin is guaranteed by policy rather than performance, the pressure to innovate, to invest, to build the capabilities you'll need when the protection ends, that pressure never arrives. And Victa, like dozens of Australian manufacturers in the same position, never felt it. In 1983, Bob Hawke won the federal election. With Paul Keating as Treasurer, the Labor government began dismantling the protectionist architecture that had sheltered Australian manufacturing for 50 years. The dollar was floated, financial markets were deregulated, tariffs were scheduled for progressive reduction across every protected sector. The Button Plan, named for Industry Minister John Button, was the specific instrument. A scheduled reduction in tariff protection designed to force efficiency, expose Australian manufacturers to genuine competition, and in theory, make them leaner and stronger. The intent was not malicious. Button and the reformers genuinely believed that the protected manufacturers had been given enough time, and that the only way to build real industrial capability was to require it rather than subsidise it. In practice, for a company that had built its entire cost structure around the assumption of protection, the tariff reductions were a slow-motion cliff. In 1984, imported mowers held a fraction of the Australian market. By 1992, that fraction had grown dramatically. Walk into a hardware shop in 1985 and Victa was still at the front. Walk into the same shop in 1992 and it was sharing space with Husqvarna, Honda, and an expanding range of unbranded Asian machines at prices that Victa, manufacturing in Western Sydney, simply could not match. The glass house was cracking. Some at Victa saw it clearly. Others believed the brand was strong enough, the loyalty deep enough, that the market would hold. They were catastrophically wrong about the second part. Chapter 7. The Decisions That Killed It. In 1986, Borg Warner sold Victa to Email Limited, the Australian white goods group. In 1996, Email sold it to Electrolux, the Swedish appliance conglomerate. Between those two transactions, a series of decisions were made that, viewed together, constitute one of the most complete failures of corporate stewardship in Australian manufacturing history. The Australian production cost per mower was rising relative to Asian competitors. Every analysis said the same thing. The only way to close the gap was to move manufacturing offshore. So they did, first components, then whole product lines. The Rydalmere workforce was cut in voluntary redundancy rounds in 1997, 1999 and 2001. Each round was announced in language about sustainable operations and long-term positioning. Each round made the factory smaller and quieter. The car park outside the main entrance, which had been full every morning since the 1960s, started showing gaps. First one row empty, then two. Meanwhile, Bunnings, expanding aggressively under Wesfarmers from 1994, was building out its outdoor power equipment range with imported product. Husqvarna, Honda, Chinese manufacturers whose cost structure made the Victa price premium look not like a quality signal, but like a tax. The chain stores had the volume to demand margins that made Australian production impossible to justify. And they used it. Here is the part that should make you angry. Consumer surveys throughout this entire period showed that Australians still trusted the Victa name. The brand equity was real and intact, even as the product was changing underneath it. People wanted to buy Australian. They wanted to believe the name still meant what it had always meant. The company had a window, not a large one, but a real one, and they didn't take it. They managed the decline instead of fighting it. And the brand that had been built on the promise of Australian making was quietly separated from Australian making, transaction by transaction, redundancy round by redundancy round, until the promise was gone and nothing was left to hold the brand up. Nino took his redundancy package in 1998. He had 35 years on the floor. He got a modest payout and a handshake. At his farewell. Chapter 9. What Remains. Stand outside the former Rydalmere site on a weekday morning and count what's left. Some of the original buildings still stand, repurposed into storage units and light commercial tenancies. The old corrugated iron facades painted over in colours that have nothing to do with green and red. Medium density housing now occupies part of the site. The press shop where Gianni Ferraro lost a finger is under someone's apartment. The car park outside what was once the main entrance is cracked and weed-broken, still marked by the ghost geometry of line markings that belong to a usage that ended 20 years ago. There is no plaque, no heritage marker, no sign that says anything happened here. The suburb absorbed it the way water fills a footprint, completely, indifferently, without memory. The grass in the margins along the fence line has gone to seed. Verdict 1. Protection without conditions is just delay. The tariff wall built Victa. That is simply true. Without it, a tinkerer in Concord does not build a national industrial empire. But the wall also gave Victa permission to avoid the question it needed to answer. What happens when the protection ends? The investment in innovation, in cost efficiency, in the global supply relationships that would have made the company competitive. That investment was never made at the required scale because it was never required. When the button plan came, Victa had not built the muscles it needed to fight without the armour. Protection without a mandatory plan for its own removal is not industry policy. It is a postponement. The bill always arrives. The only question is, who pays it? At Victa, the workers paid it. They always do. Verdict 2. A brand built on a promise dies when the promise does. At its peak, Victa was not just a product. It was a guarantee. Australian-made, Australian quality. A machine built by people like you, for a country like this. People paid more for a Victa because the name meant something beyond the machine. When Email Limited and then Electrolux moved production offshore, they believed the brand was separable from the making, that the name could keep working even after the factory went quiet. They were wrong. A brand built on a specific promise is hostage to that promise. You cannot hollow it out from underneath and expect the shell to hold. The loyalty eroded. The premium collapsed. The name that had meant everything ended up on mass-market machines in a big-box retailer, competing on price with the imports it had once kept out. You can't offshore the meaning. You can only offshore the manufacturing and wait for the meaning to follow. Verdict 3. The people who pay are never the people who decide. Aldo Ferraro spent 10 years fitting engines. Gianni spent 28 years in the press shop, and left a piece of himself on the factory floor. Tommy spent 14 years on the finishing line before the line stopped. Between them, 3 generations, 52 years of working lives given to the same company on the same site. The decision to close was made in a boardroom in Stockholm. It was announced via media release. The redundancy packages were modest. The language of commitment and community that corporations use when they need loyalty is not the language they use when they need to cut costs. Those are different documents, written for different audiences, and the gap between them is where the human damage lives. No redundancy payment covers what a working community loses when its anchor is removed. No retraining certificate gives back what 30 years of skilled identity was worth to a man at 60 Shah. The communities around Rydalmere deserved better. The record says so. It just doesn't say it anywhere the decision makers had to read it. The Echo. Somewhere in Western Sydney on a Saturday morning, if you're lucky with the timing, you'll still hear it. An old Victa, a garage sale find maybe, or a hand-me-down that outlasted everything around it because Richardson built the things to actually last. The 2-stroke catches on the first pull. Of course it does, and for a moment the whole street is 1968 again. The petrol smell, the blade pitch, that particular aggressive buzz that carried 3 backyards over and meant the weekend had officially started. It sounds exactly like it always did. The factory that made it has been silent for over 20 years.